The auctioneer's gavel came down like a gunshot. Sold. $5. To the woman in the gray coat. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd standing in the dust outside the Prescott County Courthouse. Men in wide-brimmed hats turned to look at her. A woman laughed behind a gloved hand. Someone muttered, "City girl's gonna get herself killed out there." Eleanor Hayes didn't flinch. She stood at the edge of the crowd with her chin lifted, 5 crumpled dollar bills still warm in her fist from where she'd held them the whole ride into town. Her boots were new. Her coat was too clean for this place. But her eyes, steady, unblinking, didn't match the rest of her. She had just bought a piece of land nobody wanted. 300 acres. A collapsed fence line. A cabin that hadn't seen a fire in its hearth for 11 years. And somewhere out past the ridge, though she didn't know it yet, a man who hadn't spoken more than 10 words to another living soul in almost as long. The wagon ride out took 2 hours. Eleanor sat beside the county clerk, a thin man named Mr. Dobbins who kept glancing at her like she might change her mind if he waited long enough. "You sure about this, Miss Hayes?" "I'm sure. That cabin's been empty since the Whitfield place went under. Roof's likely caved. Well's probably dry. And the nearest neighbor," he paused, choosing his words like a man crossing thin ice, "well, he doesn't get many visitors." Eleanor kept her eyes on the horizon. Flat land rolled out in every direction, gold and brown, cut only by a thin dirt road and a line of fence posts leaning like old men. "I didn't come here for neighbors," she said quietly. "I came here to disappear." Mr. Dobbins didn't ask what she meant, but the way her hands gripped the edge of the wagon seat, white-knuckled, trembling just slightly, told him more than words could. The cabin came into view slowly, the way a wound reveals itself. One wall had begun to lean. The porch steps were missing 2 boards. Weeds had grown up through the floorboards near the door, reaching toward the light like something trying to remember what it once was. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. She walked toward the cabin the way a person walks toward something they've been dreaming about for a long time. Slow, careful, almost afraid it might vanish if she moved too fast. Her hand touched the door frame. Splinters caught at her glove. She didn't pull away. "This is mine," she whispered. Behind her, Mr. Dobbins set down her single trunk and a crate of supplies. "You have enough here for a week, maybe 2 if you're careful. After that, I'll figure it out." He hesitated, then tipped his hat. "There's a man about a mile past the ridge. Goes by Colt Hendricks. Keeps to himself. If you need anything—" "I won't need anything from a stranger." Mr. Dobbins almost smiled. "Everybody says that, Miss Hayes." First week, the wagon creaked away, leaving her alone with the wind and the ticking of the cabin's old wood settling in the afternoon sun. For the first time in 3 years, nobody knew where she was. For the first time in 3 years, she could breathe. Night came fast on the plains. Eleanor lit a single candle she'd brought from the city, a small, foolish comfort, wax already half melted from the journey, and sat on the floor of the cabin because there was no furniture, no bed, nothing but 4 walls and a roof with one visible gap where the stars blinked through. She pulled her coat tighter. Somewhere outside, a coyote called, long and lonesome, and something in her chest tightened before it eased. She was not afraid of the sound. She had learned, back home, that the things that hurt you rarely announce themselves. They don't howl. They smile. They wear nice suits and say your name softly before they take everything from you. Out here, at least, the danger was honest. She reached into her coat and pulled out a folded photograph, its edges soft from handling. A man's face, kind eyes, a gentle smile that had once meant safety and now meant something closer to grief. She didn't cry. She had done enough of that already. She simply looked at it for a long moment, then folded it back in her pocket, blew out the candle, and lay down on the hard floor beneath the broken roof, letting the cold October air settle over her like a blanket she hadn't earned yet. She did not know that a mile past the ridge, a light was burning in another window. She did not know that its owner had already seen the smoke from her chimney, the first smoke that cabin had shown in 11 years, and had stood in his doorway for a long, long time, just watching it rise. Colt Hendricks had not spoken to another person in 6 weeks. Not out of cruelty, out of habit. Grief has a way of teaching a man silence, and Colt had been a very good student. He was 34 years old, though the sun and the years had carved lines into his face that made him look older. Not old in a tired way, but old in a way that suggested he had carried something heavy for a long time and simply stopped setting it down. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles from years of fence work and horse work, and the kind of labor that doesn't ask permission before it takes a piece of you. His eyes were pale blue, the color of a sky right before a storm breaks, calm, but you could tell something was coming. He kept a small herd of cattle. He kept a horse named Ranger that he talked to more than he talked to people. He kept a house that was clean, but empty in a way that had nothing to do with dust. And he kept, in a drawer he rarely opened, a woman's hairpin and a child's small wooden horse, worn smooth from little hands that no longer existed. When he saw the smoke rising from the old Whitfield cabin, something in his chest moved for the first time in a long while. Not hope, exactly. He didn't trust that word anymore. But something. He stood on his porch until the sun went down, watching the thin gray line curl up into the darkening sky, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, he found himself saying, out loud to no one, "Somebody's home." Morning broke cold and gray. Eleanor woke stiff and sore, her breath fogging in front of her face. The cabin, in daylight, looked worse than it had the night before. She could see clear through the gap in the roof to a pale, overcast sky, and the wind found every crack in the walls like it had been waiting years for company. She sat up slowly and looked around at what she had bought. $5, she thought. $5 for a roof full of holes and a floor that creaked like it might give way beneath her. Her mother would have called it madness. Her mother, God rest her, had called most of Eleanor's choices madness in the last few years. Leaving the city, leaving the life that had been mapped out for her, leaving the man everyone had expected her to marry. But her mother hadn't been in that house the night everything fell apart. Her mother hadn't seen what Eleanor had seen, hadn't understood why $5 and 300 empty acres felt less frightening than one more day in that world. She stood, brushed the dust from her coat, and stepped out onto the porch. The land spread out before her, endless and quiet, mist still clinging low to the fields. It should have felt lonely. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing she'd stood in front of in years. She was about to turn back inside when she saw him, a rider, far off near the ridge line, sitting still on a dark horse, watching her cabin the way a man watches something he isn't sure is real. Eleanor's breath caught. Neither of them moved. For a long moment, across 100 yards of cold morning air, the woman who had come to disappear and the man who had already vanished simply looked at each other. Then, without a word, without so much as a nod, the rider turned his horse and disappeared back over the ridge, leaving Eleanor standing alone on her broken porch, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't name, staring at the empty place where he'd been. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that by winter, he would be the only reason she was still alive. She only knew one thing, standing there in the cold October light, watching the dust settle where his horse had stood. Whoever he was, he would be back. He didn't come back that day, or the next. Eleanor told herself she didn't care. She spent her mornings clearing weeds from the porch, her afternoons patching the roof with scrap wood Mr. Dobbins had left behind, her evenings sitting by a small fire she'd finally managed to build in the old stone hearth. She told herself the rider was just a rancher checking his fence line. Nothing more. But every so often, without meaning to, she found herself glancing toward the ridge. By the fourth day, her hands were blistered from hauling water from a well she'd had to dig clear of debris herself. By the fifth day, she was down a half a sack of flour and a strip of dried meat that wasn't going to last much longer. By the sixth day, the wind turned cold enough that she understood, with a kind of quiet dread, that winter on the plains did not wait politely for a woman to get her affairs in order. She was standing at the edge of her land on the seventh morning, staring at a fence post that had rotted clean through, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned fast, heart in her throat. The same dark horse, the same still, watching rider. Only this time, he didn't turn away. He rode closer, slow and unhurried, the way a man approaches something he doesn't want to spook. He stopped a respectful distance off and sat there a moment, studying her the way a person studies weather, trying to guess if it's going to pass or turn into something worse. "You're the one who bought the Whitfield place," he said. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. "I am." Eleanor lifted her chin, refusing to let him see how much her hands were shaking. "Eleanor Hayes. Colt Hendricks." He nodded toward the cabin. "Roof's bad. I noticed. Well's probably no good either. Whitfield never dug it deep enough. I noticed that too." She wiped her palms on her skirt, aware of how ragged she must look. Hair coming loose from its pins, dirt under her nails, a tear in her sleeve from the fence wire. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Hendricks?" Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one, passing through and gone before it could take shape. "No," he said, "just making sure you weren't a ghost." He turned his horse before she could ask what he meant by that, and rode back toward the ridge, leaving her standing there with more questions than she'd had before he arrived. He came again 3 days later, and then 4 days after that. Each time he said little. Each time he left something behind, a length of good rope, a jar of honey, a worn but sturdy axe he claimed he didn't need anymore, though Eleanor suspected that wasn't true. She never asked him to stay. He never offered to. But the visits became a rhythm neither of them spoke of out loud. The way she started listening for hoofbeats in the late afternoon, the way he started riding the long way around his own fence line, just so it would pass near her cabin. It was on his fifth visit that she finally asked, "Why do you keep coming out here, Mr. Hendricks?" He was crouched by her well, testing the depth with a length of rope and a stone. He didn't look up right away. "Ground's hard out here," he said finally. "Woman alone. First winter. Most people don't make it through without help. Figured somebody ought to keep an eye on things." "That's not an answer." He straightened, met her eyes for the first time since he'd arrived. Something old and tired lived behind that pale blue gaze. Something Eleanor recognized because she carried the same thing in her own chest. "No," he admitted. "It's not." He didn't explain further, and she didn't push. But that night, sitting by her fire, Eleanor found herself thinking about the way his hands had gone still on the rope when she asked. The way his jaw had tightened, just slightly, like a man bracing against a memory. She had learned, over the last 3 years, to recognize pain when she saw it. She had become fluent in its many disguises. Colt Hendricks wore his very well, but not well enough to hide it from her. Winter arrived early and without mercy. The first true storm hit on a Tuesday, rolling in from the west like something alive, a wall of gray sky and screaming wind that turned the world outside the cabin into a blur of white and ice. Eleanor had patched the roof as best she could, but as best she could was not the same as well enough. By midnight, water was dripping through in 3 places, the wind was finding every gap in the walls, and the fire she'd built was struggling against a draft that seemed determined to snuff it out. She was on her knees in front of the hearth, feeding it kindling with hands gone numb, when she heard pounding at her door. For a moment, fear seized her. Old fear, city fear, the kind that had followed her 300 miles and apparently hadn't finished with her yet. Then she heard his voice through the wood. "Miss Hayes, open the door." She threw it open to find Colt standing there, snow crusted on his shoulders, his horse tied to the porch rail behind him, half buried already in drifting white. "You'll freeze in here tonight," he said, stepping past her without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the leaking roof, the guttering fire, the thin blanket she'd wrapped around her shoulders. "This won't hold. I don't need rescuing, Mr. Hendricks." "Didn't say you did." He was already moving, dragging her trunk closer to the hearth, blocking the worst of the draft with anything he could find. "Said you'll freeze." Different thing. He worked in silence for the better part of an hour, patching the worst gap in the roof from the inside with an old tarp he'd brought, rebuilding the fire until it roared instead of struggled, checking the door and windows for every place the wind could get its fingers in. Eleanor watched him from across the room, arms wrapped around herself, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a very long time. Safe. It frightened her more than the storm did. He didn't leave that night. The storm made it impossible, and even Colt, proud, silent, guarded Colt, wasn't foolish enough to ride back out into a whiteout that could kill a man within a mile of his own front door. He sat on the floor near the fire, back against the wall, hat pulled low, saying nothing. Eleanor sat across from him, close enough to feel the fire's heat, far enough to feel proper. "Thank you," she said finally into the quiet crackle of the flames. "For coming." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Had a wife once," he said so softly the wind almost swallowed it. "And a little girl." Eleanor went very still. Diphtheria took them both. Same winter. 6 years back. He stared into the fire, his voice flat in the way voices go when a person has told themselves a story so many times the words have worn smooth, like river stones. "I wasn't fast enough getting the doctor. Wasn't strong enough to save either of them. Been out here alone ever since. Colt, didn't tell you for sympathy." He finally looked at her, and in the firelight, his pale eyes looked almost silver. "Told you, because when I saw smoke coming from this chimney 7 days ago, first thing I thought was somebody else is going to freeze out here alone, and I'm not going to let it happen twice." Eleanor's throat tightened. She thought of the photograph folded in her coat pocket. She thought of the man in it, and the life she had run 300 miles to escape, and the reason she had never once said out loud to another living soul. "I understand more than you know," she whispered. He studied her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Two people who had each buried something, sitting on either side of a fire that refused to go out. "Your turn," he said quietly. "Why does a woman with hands too soft for fence work come out to the middle of nowhere and pay $5 for a house nobody wanted?" Eleanor opened her mouth, and that was the exact moment they both heard it, a sound cutting through the storm outside, faint but unmistakable. Hoofbeats, fast ones, coming hard through the snow, straight toward the cabin. Colt was on his feet before the sound had even fully registered, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle propped by the door. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, because she recognized the rhythm of that approach. She recognized the urgency of a man who rode like he owned whatever ground he was crossing. And in the space of one held breath, staring at the door as the hoofbeats grew louder, Eleanor Hayes understood, with cold and total certainty, that the path she had ridden 300 miles to escape had just found her. The pounding on the door was different this time. Not careful, like Colt's had been. Hard, angry, entitled. "Eleanor, I know you're in there." Her whole body went rigid at the sound of that voice. A voice that had once whispered promises in a candlelit parlor back east, and later, in the dark, had whispered something far uglier. Colt's eyes cut to her. "You know him." It wasn't a question, Richard Colby. The name came out of her like something spat. The man I was supposed to marry. The door shuddered under another fist. Open this door. We need to talk. Colt moved without hesitation, placing himself between Eleanor and the entrance, rifle now resting easy but ready in his hands. Storm like this, man's either desperate or dangerous. Sometimes both. Both, Eleanor whispered. She thought of the last night in that house. The shattered mirror, the bruise she'd hidden under long sleeves for 2 weeks, the moment she'd finally understood that the life mapped out for her was going to end with her either broken or buried. She had taken what money she could gather, boarded a train under a name that wasn't quite a lie, and ridden as far west as it would carry her. She had thought 300 miles would be enough. She had been wrong. Colt opened the door only enough to fill the frame with his shoulders, blocking the view inside. Snow swirled around a man standing on the porch. Tall, well-dressed even now, his coat too fine for the storm, his face handsome in the practiced way of men who had never had to earn anything. "Who are you?" Richard demanded, trying to look past Colt into the cabin. "Man who lives a mile that way." Colt said evenly, "You're on private land, mister, and whether that'll kill your horse if you don't get it under cover soon. State your business or turn around." "My business is with her." Richard's eyes finally found Eleanor across the room, and something in his expression shifted. Satisfaction, cold and certain, the look of a man who believes he has already won. "Hello, Eleanor. Took me 3 months and half my father's money to track you out to this godforsaken nothing. You really thought you could just disappear?" "I did disappear," Eleanor said, forcing her voice steady even as her hands trembled at her sides. "You're the one who refused to let me stay gone. You're my wife." "I was never your wife." Eleanor stepped forward, closer to the door despite everything in her wanting to run the other way. "We were never married, Richard. You just decided I belonged to you, and everyone around us was too polite to argue." Richard's jaw tightened. For a moment, the mask of civility slipped, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man who had put his hand around her throat in a moment of temper and called it love the next morning. "You'll come home," he said, quieter now, more dangerous for it. "Tonight, if I have to drag you through this storm myself." Colt's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "You won't." Richard's eyes flicked to him, sizing him up the way men like Richard always sized up men like Colt, and finding, to his visible irritation, that the rifle in Colt's hands and the stillness in his pale eyes did not belong to a man who could be talked over. "This isn't your concern, rancher. Made it my concern the day I decided nobody freezes or bleeds on this land while I'm standing on it." Colt's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Storm's getting worse. You've got maybe 20 minutes before that horse of yours can't make it back to town." I'd use them. For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. The wind howled through the gap between them. Somewhere behind Richard, his horse stamped and shivered, ears pinned back against the cold. Richard's gaze slid past Colt one last time, landing on Eleanor with something between a threat and a promise. "This isn't finished." "It is for tonight," Colt said, and closed the door. They stood in silence for a long time after the hoofbeats faded back into the storm. Eleanor's legs finally gave out, not from injury but from the simple, overwhelming release of terror she had been carrying, unspoken, for 3 months. She sank onto the trunk near the fire, hands pressed over her face, shoulders shaking. Colt didn't rush to comfort her with empty words. He simply set the rifle aside, crouched down in front of her, and waited, the way a man waits by a fence gate for a spooked animal to decide, on its own, that it's safe to come closer. "He hurt you," Colt said quietly. Not a question. Eleanor nodded, still not lifting her face. "Bad. Bad enough that I stopped recognizing the woman in the mirror." Her voice cracked. "I ran because I finally understood he wasn't going to stop. Not the ring, Not the wedding date already announced in the papers. Not my own mother telling me to be grateful a man like that wanted me. None of it mattered. I just needed to be gone before. She stopped, swallowed hard. Before it went further than bruises. Colt was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had a rough edge to it that hadn't been there before. I buried my wife and my daughter because I wasn't fast enough to save them from something I couldn't control, he said. Sickness doesn't care how hard you fight it, but a man like that, his jaw flexed. A man like that is a different kind of storm. And this one, I can do something about. Eleanor finally looked up, meeting his eyes through the firelight. He'll come back, she whispered, when the storm clears. I know. I don't want you caught up in this. It's not your fight. Colt studied her for a long moment, something settling behind his pale eyes. A decision being made, quiet and final. The way decisions get made on land where a man's word is the only law that matters for 50 miles in any direction. Made it my fight today. I watched smoke rise from a chimney that had been cold for 11 years, he said. Some things don't ask permission before they become yours to protect. Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest. Not pain this time, but something warmer, something she hadn't let herself feel since long before Richard Colby had ever spoken her name. Neither of them said anything else that night, but when Eleanor finally fell asleep by the fire, it was to the sound of Colt keeping watch by the window, rifle across his knees, silhouette steady against the storm. For the first time in 3 years, she slept without dreaming of running. The storm broke 2 days later, leaving the plains buried under a clean, blinding white. Richard returned on the 3rd day, exactly as promised, but this time, he wasn't alone. He'd brought the county sheriff, a paper of dubious legality claiming Eleanor as his lawful betrothed and himself as rightful guardian of her affairs, and enough confidence to believe that paperwork and a badge would succeed where storms and threats had failed. He hadn't counted on the whole county, already knowing Colt Hendricks. Hadn't counted on Mr. Dobbins riding out at first light to stand as witness. Hadn't counted on Sheriff Adams reading that flimsy paper twice, looking at Eleanor's steady eyes and Colt's silent, unmoving presence beside her, and understanding exactly what kind of man had ridden 300 miles to reclaim something he'd never actually owned. Ma'am, the sheriff said finally, folding the paper closed, you own this land free and clear, bought fair at auction. Nothing in this document changes that. And far as I can tell, you're not wanted for any crime, just wanted by him. He nodded toward Richard, not unkindly, but with the flat finality of a door closing. That's not the same thing. Richard's composure finally cracked all the way through. He shouted. He threatened. He reached for Eleanor's arm across the porch rail, and found his wrist caught, mid-motion, in a grip like iron. Colt didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Touch her again, he said quietly, and it won't be the sheriff you're dealing with next time. Something in Colt's stillness, the same stillness that had once faced down sickness he couldn't fight and lost everything anyway, the same stillness that had spent 6 years learning exactly how much a man could survive, finally made Richard Colby understand that this was a battle already lost. He left within the hour. He did not come back. Spring came slow and green across the plains, the way it always does after a long, hard winter, patient, forgiving, arriving one small mercy at a time. The cabin no longer leaked. The roof had been rebuilt board by board, most evenings, by 2 people who found they had less and less to say about the weather and more to say about everything else. The well ran clean and deep. Wildflowers had begun pushing up through the ground where weeds had grown wild the autumn before. Eleanor stood on her porch one evening in April, watching Colt ride up the same path he'd first appeared on all those months ago. Not a stranger now, not a ghost checking on smoke from an empty chimney, but something steadier, something that had grown the way trust always grows, one honest season at a time. He swung down from his horse, and for a moment they simply looked at each other the way they had that very first frozen morning. Except now there was no fear in it, no distance, only the quiet certainty of two people who had each been broken and had somehow, slowly, without either of them fully noticing when it happened, become each other's mending. "Got something to ask you," Colt said, turning his hat over in his hands, uncharacteristically nervous in a way that made Eleanor's heart lift. "Ask it." He looked past her at the cabin, repaired now, warm light glowing in its windows, smoke curling steady from a chimney that had once stood cold and forgotten for 11 long years. "Been thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe a house shouldn't have just one name over the door." Eleanor felt her breath catch, felt 3 years of running and hiding and surviving finally settle, quiet and whole, into something that felt astonishingly like home. She didn't answer with words. She simply stepped down off the porch, crossed the small patch of new spring grass between them, and took his rough, weathered hand in both of hers. The same hands that had rebuilt her roof, guarded her door through a storm and a stranger both, and without either of them planning it, slowly rebuilt everything inside her that she had once believed was too broken to fix. Behind them, the cabin stood strong against the wide Kansas sky. No longer abandoned, no longer forgotten, no longer just a $5 gamble on a cold October morning. It was at long last exactly what it had always been waiting to become, a home.